A sinister whisper slithered through the palaces of old Europe while reports landed on the desk of the young Spanish king, their dry words colder than steel. The bride is flawed. This was not merely advice, but a verdict delivered by fate itself, a diagnosis pronounced upon an entire dynasty. But what power did the warnings of ministers and the icy stares of European aristocracy hold when a monarch, blinded by love, already saw in the beautiful English princess his one and only queen? He was prepared to defy them all, the church, politics, even science itself, never suspecting that he was leading to the altar not just a woman, but the living embodiment of a family secret, a dark legacy that would turn his dynasty into a stage for Greek tragedy. We are accustomed to seeing this story as a mere romantic drama, a fairy tale with a sad ending, told only in whispers. But what if I told you that behind the splendor of wedding celebrations and the gloss of official portraits lay a cynical conspiracy of silence, where doctors and diplomats lied to the face of an entire nation? Today, we will pull back the velvet curtains on one of the most closely guarded secrets of European royalty. We will walk the razor's edge between high politics, genetics, and personal catastrophe to understand how a single drop of blue blood, which turned out to be poisoned, nearly brought down an entire empire, and why the true cause of this drama was kept silent for almost 100 years. So, who was she, this beautiful Englishwoman, Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg, known affectionately to her family as Anna? Picture a girl born in the Scottish castle of Balmoral, the goddaughter of the most powerful woman in the world, her grandmother, Queen Victoria. She was the embodiment of the Edwardian ideal: golden hair, radiant eyes, and impeccable manners. But behind this gleaming facade, within her very blood, lay a heritage far older and darker than any royal lineage. It was a genetic time bomb planted by her great-grandmother, the grandmother of Europe. Queen Victoria, without ever knowing it, had become the source of the so-called royal disease, a curse she generously distributed to her descendants along with their thrones, titles, and palaces. This illness, known to science as hemophilia, was an invisible poison passed down through the female line, yet it struck only the men, turning the smallest scratch into a mortal threat. And Victoria Eugenie, tragically, was one of those who carried this fatal spark. By the time she met King Alfonso, the tragic script had already been written and even performed on other stages across Europe. Two of her cousins, also granddaughters of Victoria, had already known the full horror of this family fate. Princess Irene of Prussia had watched two of her three sons fade away. And in distant snow-covered Russia, her cousin Alex, who became Empress Alexandra Feodorovna, was driven to despair, praying for the life of her only son, Tsarevich Alexei. Every bruise, every accidental scrape became a prelude to catastrophe for the entire imperial court. These stories were no secret among the royal families. They were the whispers that echoed in gilded corridors, a topic awkwardly avoided in letters, a piece of knowledge that separated one of us from the rest of the world. It was rumored that Ina's uncle, the British King Edward VII, a pragmatic man far from sentimental, had tried in a private conversation to open the Spanish king's eyes. In a cigar smoke-filled study, he likely laid out this genetic house of cards for Alfonso, pointing to Russia and Prussia as living proof of the impending disaster. But what power does reason hold over a southern heart engulfed in flames? Alfonso, the spoiled heir of an ancient crown, accustomed to the world revolving around his desires, simply waved it all away. He didn't see a carrier of a dangerous gene. He saw the woman of his dreams. And this is where high politics, cynical and merciless, entered the game. For the British Empire, an alliance with Spain was a tantalizing prize. Spain controlled the Strait of Gibraltar, a key maritime artery. A friendly monarch in Madrid was far more important than the hypothetical health problems of his future children. Therefore, official London not only turned a blind eye to the princess's Flaw, but did everything to ensure the marriage took place. Any doubts were delicately suppressed, and the medical risks were drowned in a flood of diplomatic courtesies and assurances of eternal friendship. In those years, genetics was a young science, and hemophilia was seen more as a mystical curse than a comprehensible medical diagnosis. It wasn't shouted about in the newspapers, it was shamefully hidden, like a disgraceful family secret. The public only knew that in royal families, princes were sometimes delicate or of frail health. It was an era when appearances were more important than reality, and the facade of monarchical well-being had to be maintained at all costs. And so, to the sound of ringing bells and the roar of an ecstatic crowd, Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg, beautiful and doomed, set foot on Spanish soil, carrying love in her heart and tragedy in her blood. No one could have guessed then that this marriage, which began as a fairy tale, would become the prologue to the fall of an entire monarchy. This conspiracy of silence was woven from the most expensive material in the world, royal dignity. Imagine an entire army of courtiers, diplomats, and doctors who for decades mastered the art of understatement and euphemism. They created an impenetrable cocoon around one of the world's most powerful families, shielding it from a cruel truth. And the truth was that their blue blood had proven to be as fragile as the finest porcelain. The most vivid proof of this was the fate of Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany, the youngest and most beloved son of Queen Victoria. He was a man of brilliant intellect, a patron of the arts, but from childhood his life was lived under a glass dome. He was forbidden to run or play with his peers. His path was paved with soft carpets, and his every step was shadowed by anxiety. Any accident, any trivial mishap could be fatal, and one day it was. In 1884, in sunny Cannes, the 30-year-old prince slipped on the stairs of a private club. An ordinary man would have escaped with a bruise and a few awkward apologies, but for Leopold, that fall was his last. He passed away the next day, leaving behind a young widow and 2 small children. And what did the press write about this? The Times, the voice of the British Empire, writing nearly 40 years later in 1922 on the passing of his widow, only vaguely mentioned that the Duke had always been delicate, and that his end had been unexpected. Unexpected, of course, only for those who were not privy to the secrets of this theater of shadows. For the family, the news was terrifyingly predictable. They knew the enemy they were dealing with, but the curse knew no boundaries and spared no generation. Leopold's son, Rupert, inherited not only his father's title, but also his tragic vulnerability. And once again, fate's irony revealed itself, this time cloaked in the roar of an engine and the screech of metal. At the age of 20, The young man was in a car accident in France. His injuries would have given a healthy person every chance of survival. But for a carrier of the royal disease, even minor internal bleeding was an irrevocable sentence. It wasn't the twisted metal that ended his story, but his own blood, which refused to perform its most basic function. So why did they remain so desperately silent as the lives of young men full of hope crumbled around them? First, it was a matter of prestige, an almost religious dogma of the infallibility of the monarch's flesh. To admit to a hereditary genetic flaw would be to confess their own imperfection, to strike a blow against the sacred image of God's anointed ruler. A dynasty could not be defective, or its very right to rule would be questioned. Second, marriage alliances were at stake, the primary tool of European politics. A princess known to carry a tragic gene would instantly become damaged goods on the bridal market. Her value would plummet to zero. Therefore, the truth was the most expensive and least profitable currency, and in this atmosphere of total concealment, in a world where reputation was more important than life, the young king of Spain made his fateful choice, unaware that he was signing a marriage contract not with a beautiful princess, but with her family ghost. The wedding festivities faded, leaving behind a trail of champagne, wilted flowers, and ecstatic newspaper headlines. Spain had a new queen, as beautiful as the morning dawn, and King Alfonso XIII seemed to have won his ultimate prize. But behind the walls of the Madrid palace, the fairy tale was rapidly turning into a nightmare. The first alarm bells rang when Queen Ina suffered several miscarriages. Court physicians attributed this to stress and the difficulty of adjusting to a new life. But a heavy sense of foreboding already hung in the air. Then, in May 1907, the long-awaited heir was born, the Prince of Asturias, named Alfonso, after his father. All of Spain rejoiced. A future king had arrived, a successor to the Bourbon dynasty. But the joy was short-lived, cut short by a tiny drop of blood. A few days after his birth, the baby boy was to undergo the traditional rite of circumcision. It was here, in the quiet of the royal chambers, that the invisible enemy first revealed itself. A routine procedure performed on thousands of infants every day became an agonizing ordeal for the little prince. The bleeding wouldn't stop for hours. The physicians, pale with terror, scrambled to apply every remedy they knew until, at last, they managed to save the heir's life. For King Alfonso, it was a devastating blow. All the warnings he had so carelessly dismissed, all the whispers of a flawed bride he had brushed aside as envious gossip, had suddenly become his own personal, bleeding reality. He looked at his firstborn, fragile and pale, and saw not a future monarch, but the living embodiment of his own fatal mistake. The love that had seemed an all-conquering force just yesterday began to crack, giving way to an icy disappointment and a deep, simmering rage. The honeymoon of the Spanish royal couple was over before it had even begun. From that moment on, their lives became a constant vigil, an endless wait for the next disaster. Every step little Alfonso took, every game he played, every fall from his bicycle sent a wave of panic through the entire court. His childhood was not spent on playgrounds, but within the cotton-padded walls of rooms that shielded him from a world that could destroy him. And fate, as if in mockery, was already preparing its final, most cruel act for him. 31 years later, in exile, Prince Alfonso would be in a car accident in Miami. He would suffer only a few scrapes and bruises, injuries that for anyone else would have been a trivial nuisance. But for him, they were a death sentence. Just like his great-uncle Rupert, his life would be cut short not by the force of the impact, but by the failure of his own blood. This first tragedy was merely the overture to a full symphony of grief that was yet to echo through the halls of the Spanish palace. It was the stone that, dislodged from the summit, triggered an unstoppable avalanche. The king, who had dreamed of a powerful dynasty and healthy heirs, was dealt a genetic lottery in which nearly every ticket was a losing one. He had tried to defy fate, but fate had only laughed cynically in his face, presenting him with the bill for his blind love. From that point forward, the history of the Spanish Bourbons took a different tragic path, one written not in ink on parchment, but in blood that would not clot. And Queen Victoria Eugenie, a foreigner in this land, was left to bear the full weight of the guilt for a curse she had brought with her in her wedding trousseau. If King Alfonso had hoped that fate, having struck one cruel blow, would be satisfied and leave his family in peace, he was gravely mistaken. Tragedy does not come alone. It brings its sisters, and soon the royal palace became their grim residence. The avalanche, set in motion by the birth of a sick heir, was only gaining destructive momentum. A year after her firstborn arrived, Queen Ana gave birth to a second son, Infante Jaime. For the first few weeks, it seemed as if the heavens had taken pity on the royal couple. The boy looked healthy and strong, but soon the doctors and nannies began to notice something was wrong. The child didn't respond to sounds, to his mother's call, to the rattle of his toys. His world was shrouded in an eternal, impenetrable silence. The diagnosis came as another sentence: deafness, most likely the result of a botched operation in infancy. And so, the second prince in line to the throne was cut off from the world of sound, and thus from the possibility of ever fully ruling a country in an age of radio and public speeches. For the king, it was another blow to his dynastic ambitions. Instead of two healthy sons to support his throne, he had one whose life hung by a thread and another deprived of one of the most vital senses. But even then, the cup of suffering was not yet full. The royal cradle continued to demand new sacrifices. The third child, a daughter named Beatrice, and the fourth, Maria Cristina, were thankfully born healthy girls, but by the laws of succession, they could not claim the throne. They could only become carriers of the fatal gene for future generations of European dynasties, living reminders of the family curse. Then came another tragedy, swift and silent. The fifth child, a son, passed away shortly after birth, and in 1914, as the clouds of the First World War gathered over Europe, a private catastrophe erupted within the Spanish royal family. The youngest son, Infante Gonzalo, was born. It soon became clear that he, like his older brother Alfonso, had inherited his mother's terrible gift, hemophilia. Now, there were two princes in the palace whose lives were a constant battle for survival, two boys made of glass, who had to be protected from every sharp corner, from every single stare. And Gonzalo's fate proved to be a tragic echo of his relatives. At the age of 19, while on holiday in Austria, he and his sister were in a minor car accident. The girl escaped without a scratch, but the young man who struck his chest against the steering wheel, would pass away 2 days later from internal bleeding. Thus, of the 5 sons born to strengthen the dynasty, 4 were struck from the list of potential heirs. 1 was mortally ill, a 2nd was deaf, a 3rd did not survive infancy, and a 4th also suffered from hemophilia. The entire weight of hope, the full responsibility for the future of the Spanish monarchy, fell on the shoulders of one man, Don Juan, Count of Barcelona. He was the only healthy son, the sole hope of a fading dynasty, and it was he who was destined to become the father of the future King of Spain, Juan Carlos I. Can you imagine the atmosphere that pervaded that palace? It was not a home, but a hospital, not a center of power, but an abode of fear and sorrow. Every day was laced with anxiety. Every piece of news about the children made hearts stop. King Alfonso XIII, one of the most powerful monarchs of his time, was helpless against a microscopic enemy hidden in his own wife's genes. He could command armies, but he could not command his son's blood to clot. And this helplessness gnawed at his soul, turning love to ash and family life into a slow, agonizing torture. Shared grief, as we know, can either unite people, forging them into an unbreakable fortress, or it can become an acid that corrodes the strongest of bonds. In the case of the Spanish royal family, the second, more destructive scenario played out. The children's illness did not become the cement that would mend the cracks in their marriage. Instead, it turned into a bottomless abyss that grew wider with each passing day until it finally separated Alfonso and Ana, turning them into strangers living under the same roof. The king, raised with an absolute belief in his own rights and infallibility, could not accept this blow from fate with grace. His mind searched for someone to blame, and it found its target quickly and without error. In his eyes, the sole cause of all the misfortunes that had befallen his dynasty was her, his wife, the woman he had once loved so madly. He saw her not as a victim of circumstance, but as the source of the contagion, a Trojan horse that had carried the seeds of destruction into the impenetrable fortress of the Spanish Bourbons. The love that had once blinded him faded as quickly as it had ignited, leaving behind only the bitter ashes of disappointment and a cold, vengeful fury. Alfonso did not just distance himself from his wife, he began a psychological war against her. Accusations, first whispered in the privacy of their bedroom, soon became open, humiliating, and sometimes even made in the presence of the court. He never forgave her for the tainted blood she had brought into his family. He openly took a string of mistresses, making little effort to conceal his affairs, as if to punish her for her failure to give him healthy heirs. For Victoria Eugenie, or Ana, as her loved ones called her, dark times had begun. She found herself in complete isolation. In a foreign country, at a court rife with complex intrigues and a centuries-old resentment of outsiders, she was left utterly alone, without any support. While her cousin, the Russian Empress Alexandra Feodorovna, was always sustained in her grief by a boundlessly loving husband and devoted daughters, Ana had no one. Her husband had become her chief tormentor, and the Spanish aristocracy, which had never warmed to the Protestant Englishwoman, now had a powerful reason to gloat and gossip behind her back. She became the Flawed Queen, a living symbol of national humiliation. Her life devolved into a series of rituals devoid of all meaning and warmth. She had to smile at official receptions, attend military parades, and engage in charity work, all while maintaining the mask of unflappable royal dignity. But behind this flawless facade was a woman crushed by guilt and endless loneliness. All her energy, all her unspent love was channeled toward her ailing sons. She became a caregiver, a nurse, a guardian angel for those whose very existence was a constant reminder of her curse. She spent sleepless nights by their bedsides, learned to administer first aid, and sought out the best doctors in all of Europe, clinging to any hope, no matter how faint. This marriage, which had begun as the most romantic of fairy tales, had turned into a life sentence in a gilded cage where her only companions were fear, pain, and the knowledge that the man who had sworn eternal love to her had become her chief jailer. A great passion that had defied all laws of reason had ended in a great tragedy, with no victors, only victims. And what of the heir himself, the Prince of Asturias, Alfonso, the firstborn on whom the nation's hopes were pinned, and who, from birth, became the center of this family drama? His life is a separate, sorrowful tale of unfulfilled expectations and a stolen childhood. Not much information about him has survived, as if the official chronicles were ashamed to peer into his medical records, but from the few fragments that have come down to us, a portrait emerges of a young man imprisoned in the crystal dungeon of his own body. Perhaps his episodes were not as agonizing as those of his third cousin, Tsarevich Alexei of Russia, whose suffering became a catalyst for political crisis. But his health was so fragile that a normal life for an heir to the throne was out of the question. Any physical exercise, horseback riding, fencing, all the essential components of a future king and military leader's education were strictly forbidden to him. His world was confined to the walls of the Madrid palace and a country estate, where his only solace was raising chickens and pigs. Only there, far from the etiquette of the court, in the company of animals, could he feel like an ordinary person rather than a living symbol of dynastic catastrophe. Among the common people, always prone to myth-making, the most incredible rumors circulated about the heir's strange illness. It was whispered that every morning the prince was brought a glass of fresh, still warm bull's blood, which he drank to sustain his life force. This grim legend was, of course, far from the truth, but it accurately reflected the general sentiment. The heir's life was being artificially maintained. He was like a walking dead man, trapped between the world of the living and the world of shadows. But the most tragic and absurd part of this situation was that, just as in the Russian Empire, the sick, clearly non-viable heir continued to be regarded as the future monarch. The state machine, with all its stubborn inertia, pretended that everything was fine. He was prepared for a role he could never physically fulfill. He was taught subjects that would likely be of no use to him. It was a theater of the absurd, where all the actors played their parts, knowing full well that the play's finale would be tragic. The system was afraid to admit the obvious. The emperor had no clothes, and the heir was terminally ill. To acknowledge this would be to trigger a dynastic crisis, and no one wanted to take that responsibility. The resolution came after the fall of the monarchy in 1931, when the family was forced into exile. Freedom from state duties untied Don Alfonso's hands. While receiving treatment at a Swiss clinic, he met the love of his life, a beautiful young Cuban woman named Edelmira San Pedro Ochejo y Robato. She was not an aristocrat, her blood was not blue, but for him, she was a breath of fresh air, a chance at the simple human life he had never had. And he made his choice. For the sake of marrying the woman he loved, he officially renounced his dynastic rights to the non-existent Spanish throne. This was not just a romantic gesture, but an act of profound personal liberation. He cast off the unbearable burden that fate had placed on him from birth. He shifted the full weight of responsibility onto the shoulders of his healthy younger brother, Don Juan, and perhaps, for the first time in his life, felt truly free. He chose love over a crown, a brief moment of personal happiness over a duty to a dynasty that saw him only as a problem. And in that choice, there was more royal dignity than in all the years of his agonizing existence as an heir. The problem of succession, which had hung over the Spanish crown like a sword of Damocles for decades, was resolved with surgical precision and quiet sadness. Following his older brother Alfonso, who chose love over the throne, the second son, the deaf Infante Jaime, also renounced his dynastic rights. He too found happiness in a morganatic marriage, clearing the path for his only healthy brother, Don Juan. Thus, at the cost of the personal happiness of two princes, the dynasty was saved. The diseased branches were carefully pruned to allow the family tree to sprout new healthy shoots. The responsibility for the future of the monarchy, however ghostly and exiled it might be, fell upon the man to whom fate had granted the most precious gift for any heir: good health. It was a pragmatic and ultimately correct decision that drew a line under an entire era of family tragedy. For Victoria Eugenie herself, the fall of the monarchy and subsequent exile became a bitter, yet in some ways, liberating finale. The noisy, intrigue-filled and hostile life at the Madrid court was replaced by silence and tranquility. She settled in Switzerland on the shores of Lake Geneva in a cozy villa named Vieille Fontaine, which translates to Old Fountain. The name was remarkably symbolic. She herself had become the source from which her descendants drew both life and sorrow. Here, far from judgmental eyes and political storms, she finally found what she had been denied for decades: respect and peace. She was no longer the flawed queen. She was simply Ina, the head of a large family scattered across Europe, a matriarch who had endured unimaginable trials and yet retained her royal dignity. The years softened the sharp edges, and she transformed into a living legend, a respected queen in exile whose life journey evoked not malice, but sympathy and admiration. Decades passed. Spain changed beyond recognition. And then, in February 1968, 37 years after her exile, Victoria Eugenie received an invitation to return to the land that had once been both her paradise and her hell. The occasion was exceptional, deeply personal and symbolic. She was to be the godmother of her great-grandson, the young Infante Felipe, the son of Juan Carlos and Sofia of Greece, the boy who would one day become King Felipe VI of Spain. It was more than a family celebration. It was an act of historical reconciliation. Spain, in the form of its future, was extending a hand to the woman it had once blamed for all its woes, and she accepted the invitation. Her only return to Spain was brief. but it encapsulated a lifetime. An elderly lady, filled with a quiet dignity, descended the airplane steps to fulfill her final mission. In the church that day, holding the infant, the future king, in her arms, she must have seen her entire life flash before her eyes. Her youthful love, her hopes, the birth of her firstborn, the horror of the diagnosis, the series of losses, the loneliness, and finally, this quiet triumph. In that moment, the circle was complete. The woman who had been accused of bringing a curse upon the House of Bourbon was now blessing its future, its hope for rebirth. A little over a year later, in April 1969, her earthly journey came to an end. She passed away at her villa in Switzerland, leaving behind a complex, tragic, and majestic story. Thus, the tale of a queen that began with the words, "a flawed bride," concluded with the silent acknowledgement that it was through her, through all the tragedies and losses, that the Spanish crown had managed to find and secure its future.